Hello everyone, this is a continuation of our series of all 1,800 kilometers of bike paths in Korea, for a total of 85 stamp booths to stamp in the Korean bike passport and receive the Grand Slam medal. And today we're looking at the East Coast Bike Path, a path that extends for most of Korea's East Coast, all the way from the very northeast of Korea right by the North Korean border at the Goseong Unification Observatory, down to Yeongdeok Sunrise Park, which would be the official section at 342 kilometers long. And as you can see, the bike path extends down towards Ulsan's Jeongdongjin Beach, but we're going to show you how to go even further all the way down to Busan's Haeundae Beach for over 600 kilometers, as it makes for the perfect spot to finish the ride and end at Korea's most famous beach with tons of restaurants, entertainment, and hotels to enjoy at the end of the journey. In this video, we'll give an overview of the path, show you how to get there, and give itineraries for different types of cyclists depending on how far you want to cycle every day, and if you want to stop in Yeongdeok and just do the official path, or continue all the way down to Busan. The itineraries are in the description of this video, which include Kakao map links for each day that can be converted to GPX files on Google Chrome if needed. And the Chrome extension that does this conversion is finicky, so sometimes you have to click around a bit and refresh to make it work. We now just have 2 spots left in our ranking, so let's see where the East Coast Bike Path slots in. The East Coast of Korea is beautiful, with crystal clear waters, tons of nice sandy beaches, and better air quality overall than Seoul. And technically the official East Coast Bike Path is comprised of 2 different paths, the Gangwon and Gyeongbuk Bike Paths, but there's only about 4 kilometers between the 2 of them, so we're going to consider them as one bike path. And as far as difficulty goes, despite being about half the length of the Four Rivers bike path between Incheon and Busan, it's the most difficult bike path in Korea, with almost the entire path consisting of hills and mountains going up and down for the whole ride. You can see here that you face about 4,200 meters of climbing for the official path, and 7,000 meters of climbing if you're going all the way to Busan. Also, a lot of it is shared road with the cars, so it's something that needs to be considered before trying it out, as it's a lot more peaceful when you get the bike path all to yourself, like the other paths in Korea. And if you haven't tried out long distance cycling at all, I'd strongly recommend trying out one of the shorter paths that we covered in part 1 and 2 of this series, just to see if you enjoy it, and then you can step up to the East Coast Bike Path if you're craving more of a challenge. When looking at the weather, I'd recommend cycling anytime between early April and late June, or early September to mid-November. And if you want to camp along the way, I'd recommend June or September for some warmer weather so you can swim in the ocean as well. And then as far as wind direction goes, wind in Korea typically comes from the northwest. So if you start in the north traveling south, you should have a good amount of tailwind, but it can vary drastically. So you'll have some headwinds no matter what. And if traveling south, you'll be on the side of the road away from the coast a lot of the time, but it didn't ruin the experience at all for us. And it makes it all the more worth it to end in Busan as well. As far as camping goes, there are plenty of beaches along the way that you can camp at for free, but it's not like cycling in Jeju where it's very clear if it's allowed or not. The best thing I can recommend is to look for other people that are camping as well, make sure it's not a paid campground or right beside one, and make sure there aren't any no camping signs around. And then it's probably okay to camp there. But because of this being a bit of a gray area, I won't make specific recommendations in this video, as I don't want to send a bunch of people to the same spot when it's not allowed. We camped on plenty of beaches in 2021 with these precautions, and had no problems for our entire trip, but we can't guarantee it'll be the same for others. And finally, when it comes to preparation, there are long stretches of about 40 kilometers or more without many convenience stores or marts, especially during the southern part of the official trail between Samcheok and Yeongdeok, and all the way down to Pohang if you're going to Busan. So it'd be good to carry a couple bottles of water and energy bars during those sections just in case. So now let's look at the path. The East Coast Bike Path starts all the way up in the north at the Goseong Unification Observatory Tower, which has views into North Korea and the demilitarized zone between the north and the south. You start the ride along the coast near some very unpopulated beaches, but there are still convenience stores, restaurants, and resorts all pretty far up north. You spend the first 50-kilometer section between Goseong and Sokcho on and away from the coast, sometimes next to the lake on the shared road with the cars, on wooden decks that go through the forest and along the coast, and even into the farmland a bit. The environment varies a lot as you pass the various beaches, and it gets denser and more civilized once you get closer to Sokcho. And by the time you make it to Sokcho, from this point for the next 140 kilometers, you'll always be near civilization, as you pass through the cities to its south in Yangyang, Gangneung, Donghae, and Samcheok. Also, Sokcho is known as a tourist hub close to the mountains, and was originally a fairly quiet resort town, but has skyrocketed in popularity in recent years. This is a great spot to spend the night, and if you'd never been to Seoraksan National Park before, you could spend 2 nights in Sokcho and visit it on your break day, as it's very beautiful and one of our favorite spots in Korea. After leaving Sokcho to the south, you're heading into Yangyang, one of the most famous spots for surfing in Korea, and also known to have a lot of nightlife during the summer on the beaches, which I haven't personally experienced. The bike path starts venturing into the mountains a little bit, with some hilly sections that aren't too intense, but definitely act as training for the upcoming hills later on in the ride. It's here where you pass Gyeongpo Beach, which has really nice sand spanning for over a kilometer, and then you'll be passing various surfing beaches over the next 40 kilometers, sometimes going inland through forests until you reach Gangneung City, the biggest city on the official East Coast bike path. Gangneung is also an amazing place to spend a night or two relaxing. It has one of the nicest beaches on the East Coast called Gyeongpo Beach, with tons of hotels, restaurants, bars, and cafes nearby. And it just has this nice relaxing feel to it. Definitely touristy, but I'd say it's a lot more relaxing than Sokcho Beach these days, just because there seems to be more space. It's also a great place if you're in need for some bike parts, as there are a fair share of bike stores around, which can be found on Naver Maps by searching 자전거, which means bike in Korean. And I'll put it in the description to copy and paste if you need. When you leave Gangneung to the south, you're away from the coast for a bit of the ride, going in and out of the forests, passing army bases, and going through the farmland. It's from this point in the ride where you start spending more time cycling on the road with the cars, and it starts to get a bit more hilly, with some fairly steep climbs, but spread out enough so they aren't too intense yet, as you enter Jeongdongjin. Jeongdongjin is a tourist beach in a park well known by Koreans for watching the sunrise during New Year's. It's one of those areas that's touristy, but not really for international tourists, so it has this cool Korean charm to it that makes it stick out from other tourist areas in Korea. It even has this cruise ship themed hotel on top of a mountain called the 썬크루즈리조트, which would be cool to stay at sometime to watch the sunrise. You then go into the mountains some more, and then back down to ride along the coast again, where you notice the atmosphere change a bit into fishing villages, and you arrive in Donghae, about 170 kilometers into the ride, and the last big city if you're doing the official route. Donghae would be a great place to spend the night and stock up on some energy bars and snacks and things, as from this point on, convenience stores and marts get a little sparse until Pohang, which is after the end of the official bike path. And there's also an E-Mart here which is like the Walmart of Korea, so you can get whatever you need before heading into the hardest section of the journey for the last 170 kilometers on the official path. You start out immediately going through Samcheok just south of Donghae, but you don't actually go into the city. And this is probably the least scenic part of the ride, as you spend a lot of time on the shared road with the cars, going past a lot of factories and industrial sections. And there are so many steep hills around here, but this will become a very familiar setting for the next 50 kilometers or so, and you definitely start to feel a bit out of civilization. But it gives you the feeling of an adventure through the mountains, unsure of what lies around the next corner, with plenty of older fishing villages that are very rarely visited by tourists, or even many Koreans. And this style of biking is only really prevalent on the East Coast bike path, and for smaller sections of the cross-country Four Rivers path. You arrive in a smaller port town called Imwon, with enough motels and amenities to spend a night at. And just when you thought you were finished with the hills, they are just getting started again. You're now about 250 kilometers into the journey, and the next 35 kilometers from Imwon to Ujeonggun is the most memorable section from the ride.
잘하고 있어.
네, 얼마 안 남아서.
아 진짜? 아 꼭대기까지.
There were so many steep hills here which seemed like they never wanted to stop. And just when you start to lose your sanity and question if this sport is something you really enjoy, you arrive in Uljin. And you're in the province of Gyeongsangbuk-do now. You can kind of breathe a sigh of relief because you're out of the mountainous Gangwon-do province and the difficult section is mostly over, as you'll be next to the coast for a while. Uljin itself is big enough to find hotels and restaurants to stay at, and you should definitely refuel here with snacks and water. And when you head south, this is one of the most enjoyable parts of the ride in my opinion. You're on the shared road, but there weren't many cars when we biked it in April 2021, but I could see there being a lot during the peak seasons. And you get some really nice views along the edge of the coast, with the deep blue East Sea water, and some beautiful beaches that barely see visitors outside the peak summer months. There are also some really interesting fishing villages that haven't been gentrified at all and still preserve their original roots, with of course, a few pretty decent sized hills that will take a lot of energy out of you, as the bike path keeps alternating between the mountains and the coast some more, and then the mountains slowly disappear the closer you get to Yeongdeok, the end of the official East Coast bike path. There is more civilization here with a lot more seafood restaurants popping up. And for the last 20 kilometers, you end up seeing a lot what life is like in the province of Gyeongsang-do, with a couple bigger hills to end the ride. And now you've made it over 340 kilometers to the Yeongdeok Sunrise Park, the official end of the East Coast bike path, which has a nice lookout over the East Sea. And if you've been collecting the stamps, you'll get your 17th and final stamp here. And from here you continue another 10 kilometers down to Ganggumyeon, which has all these crab and seafood restaurants, which would be a great spot to celebrate if you decide to finish here, as you could grab a motel and then bike back up to Yeongdeok and take a bus from there if you want. There's also a bus terminal in Ganggu that might have a bus where you're going. For those continuing on, you're now off the official East Coast bike path, but it still feels similar, as you'll still have the blue line on the road to follow along all the way until you reach Ulsan, the last big city before Busan. And also, the path gets really interesting as it goes through these narrow alleyways in the villages, and you're going in and out of civilization for the next 45 kilometers or so when you reach Pohang. Pohang is the point in the journey where you really feel like you're starting to make progress towards Busan, and it's the biggest city we've been to so far on the entire journey at over 400,000 in population. Once you get into the city center, there is a really beautiful port, and the city just has this cool, rough fishing city vibe, with the factories in the background really making it feel industrial too. It's also the perfect spot to spend a night or two at and rest up, as you can find just about anything you can think of here with its size. But you get right back into the coastal atmosphere south of Pohang, as you're heading back into some more hills, with some of them being pretty tall. And after about 30 kilometers out of Pohang, you're at Homigot, which is a tourist area with this hand sticking out of the water famous for watching the sunrise, and enough amenities nearby to spend the night if you want. After Homigot, you start heading back south again, and go through Gyeongpo, which is the last real city-like city that you'll see for the next 95 kilometers or so. So definitely prepare at one of the convenience stores here. And from here on out, it slowly starts to get easy to lose track of the bike path, because you don't see the blue line on the road for a lot of it, and it mostly feels like you're riding through a mountain highway. It feels like a true excursion, with no major civilization, but still enough to feel sane. And little beach towns that almost nobody knows about. It's areas like these where you really see what Korea looks like when it's less touched by foreign influence, compared to what you see in Seoul and Busan. There's less English everywhere, the locals look shocked sometimes seeing cyclists pass through with big cycle tour setups, and it's something you'd never see if you weren't on a bike riding down the East Coast. Then as you get closer to Ulsan, civilization starts slowly building up, and you're now in the final section of the East Coast. Busan is a massive city with high-rises everywhere, and over 1 million in population. We are now over 500 kilometers into the ride, depending on how many wrong turns you've taken by now. And on Kakao Maps, you can see that this is where the bike path stops. So I think this used to be the official ending. And from this point forward, you have just over 80 kilometers left. And you'll always be close to convenience stores, restaurants, and places to stay. So you don't have to worry too much about that. But it's also the point in the journey where we made our biggest mistake. The signs stop for the East Coast bike path, and we just used Kakao Maps to find bike directions to Busan's Haeundae Beach. It took us right onto the highway going against the traffic, and then the bike path appeared again, so we thought it was just for one small little section, but that wasn't the case. And we ended up on the highway again feeling like we had gone too far to turn around, and also hoping that the bike path would come back, but we spent over 30 kilometers on the highway, which wasn't that nice to be honest. I've seen cyclists here use highways like this before, but it just doesn't feel that safe as you watch cars and trucks whiz past you and you just pray that you aren't the victim of an accident. So instead of this, I included a route that I think is safe to follow in the itinerary, and the route mostly follows the coast, which should be a lot more enjoyable than what we went through. And for the bigger sections that have multiple lanes, it looks like there are sidewalks to cycle on safely. And then after about 60 kilometers south of Ulsan, you've made it to Busan, the second largest city in Korea. And if you follow the itinerary, it'll take you right to Haeundae Beach, which is the most famous beach in Korea, with plenty of hotels, restaurants, and nightlife to make everyone happy to celebrate the finish of the East Coast bike path. And that wraps up the overview. And we put the East Coast bike path at rank number 2 of all the bike paths in Korea. And that leaves the Four Rivers bike path at rank number 3, which we'll cover in the next video. The East Coast bike path is a real challenge, especially if you do the whole coast, and it should only be cycled by those with a sense of adventure, who don't mind a plethora of hills, and for those who enjoy being out of their comfort zone, as you'll end up really in the middle of nowhere in some areas, which I understand might not be the best for everyone. However, there's just something special about it that no other bike path here has, with the diversity riding through multiple large and small coastal cities and in and out of the mountains. The only reason why it's not number one is you're riding with the cars for most of it, and the hills really take a toll on the body. But let's look at how to get to the East Coast bike path first. The best way to travel to the East Coast is by bus. And if you want to start in the north, you should take a bus to Taejin Intercity Bus Terminal, which can be taken from the Eastern Seoul Bus Terminal for just over 25,000 won. Then it's about a 15-kilometer bike ride to the northern bike path entrance at Goseong Unification Observatory. To get to the official finish at Yeongdeok Sunrise Park, you can take a bus to Yeongdeok Bus Terminal for about 36,000 won. And it's about a 10-kilometer bike ride between the bus terminal and the Sunrise Park. And then if you're finishing in Busan, you can take a bus at Haeundae's intercity bus stop to either Nambu Bus Terminal in Seoul or Eastern Seoul Bus Terminal for about 40,000 won. And the bus terminal is really close to Haeundae Beach, right by Haeundae subway station exit 2. And just remember when you're taking the bus to arrive early to prepare and put your bikes in the luggage compartment below. And to reserve the buses, you can use the T-Money bus reservation website, which I linked in the description, and even use global cards on it if you don't live in Korea. Now let's go over an itinerary for different types of cyclists. For expert cyclists looking to cycle up to 100 kilometers a day, this itinerary will be really challenging just because of all the hills. So I'd only try this if you're really fit and ready for the challenge. It'll take you 4 days to finish the official path to Yeongdeok, and 7 days if you're cycling the whole coast down to Busan. On day 1, you'll arrive at Taejin Intercity Bus Terminal, bike up 15 kilometers to the Unification Observatory, and then back down through the forest area, past Sokcho, and into Yangyang, and stay around Naksan Beach, which has enough motels and restaurants and things to spend the night. Day 2 will be the biggest push of the ride, but in terms of elevation gain, it's a bit less intense than day 1. You start in Yangyang, bike along the coast past a ton of beaches until Gangneung, where you can have lunch, then push ahead to Donghae for a total of 99 kilometers. And now with day 3, it starts to get more intense as we go south of Donghae, as we're leaving civilization mostly here, so it's important to be prepared. You also have a total of 1,400 meters of elevation gain going through the mountains, and then finishing the ride in Ujin. And day 4 will be another 92 kilometers along mostly the coast, from Ujin to Yeongdeok, with lots of hills, and over 1,300 meters of elevation gain. And here's where you end the official East Coast bike path, and can choose to cycle 10 kilometers west to Yeongdeok where you can catch the bus, or continue on to Ganggumyeon, with all the crab restaurants to spend the night. Starting from day 5, things start to get a bit less hilly as you ride 95 kilometers along the coast with all the fishing villages and enter civilization again when arriving in Pohang. You then continue on south past Homigot and finish the ride in Gyeongpo, a nice little port city. And now by day 6, you've made it mostly into civilization, but the day will be spent riding through mostly fishing villages and vacation spots until you get to Ulsan for 84 kilometers of riding, where you can spend the night in the major city. And then that leaves you with day 7, an easier 62 kilometer final day riding from Ulsan to Busan, riding along the coast whenever possible, and then arriving at Haeundae to finish the epic 7-day journey. Now let's show the itinerary for people looking to stop more along the way and sightsee. And I broke up the trip into shorter days that'll take 7 days for the official path and 11 days to go all the way down to Busan. On day 1, you'll arrive at the Taejin Bus Terminal, ride up to the Goseong Unification Observatory, and then cycle down past all the beautiful northern beaches for a total of 67 kilometers until you reach Gyeongpo Beach, which is a surfing beach with pensions and motels just north of Sokcho. Then day 2 will be one of your longest days cycling at 69 kilometers and takes you through Sokcho and Yangyang, mostly riding along the coast, until you reach Gangneung's Gyeongpo Beach, the perfect spot to spend a night or two. On day 3, you'll start heading into the mountains a bit more, passing the tourist area of Jeongdongjin, and then arriving in Donghae for a total of 52 kilometers where you should start preparing for longer sections without marts and convenience stores. And then on day 4 and 5, things will start getting a lot more challenging, cycling 52 kilometers through the mountains on day 4 to Imwon, and then the shortest day of 36 kilometers on day 5 through the most intense section between Imwon and Ujin. On day 6, things will mellow out a bit, riding a lot more on the coast for about 47 kilometers, with some hills mixed in the middle, and then more coastal riding on the second half when you arrive at Hupo, which is a beautiful fishing town with hotels and plenty of seafood restaurants. Then on day 7, you'll finish riding the official East Coast bike path, and it'll be another intense day of hills, at 34 kilometers riding through the mountains and passing a lot of fishing villages on the coast until you reach Yeongdeok Sunrise Park. And then you can decide if you'll finish your ride by going to the bus terminal in Yeongdeok, or continue another 20 kilometers biking to Changsa Beach. And day 8 will be mostly out of civilization until the end, not really riding through any bigger cities or towns until you reach Pohang, for a total of 42 kilometers. And day 9, you have your longest day at 72 kilometers, starting in the mountains right after Pohang, cycling around the outlet going past Homigot, and then continuing south through Kuryongpo, and passing some more resort towns until you reach Gangpo, an older fishing village with motels and pensions. And then on day 10, you'll be making your way into civilization by riding up 2 decent-sized hills and a total of 56 kilometers until you make your way into Ulsan, the biggest city on the journey to Busan. And then on the final day, you finish up the trip cycling 62 kilometers into Busan, which is the section we didn't personally cycle, but it'll mostly be through civilization on the bigger roads, the coast, and a decent amount of hills to finish it off. And that does it for the East Coast Bike Path.
Finish to this day. We're at Haeundae, the end of the road. And the weather's insane. It's like a sandstorm from all this wind. 17 days to get from North Korea to Busan, basically. Today we woke up, there was like a typhoon in the morning, basically. There was rain. We ran out of water. We had the biggest hills of the entire journey. We were
on highways, riding on highways with the cars.
Riding on the dangerous highways with the cars today. The rack broke on my bike down there, so this thing is like out of balance. Then we had the hardest hill of the whole journey right at the end, right at Tamajigi. Well, we're here. Good job, babe. 수고했어.
We hope this video was helpful to introduce an amazing place in Korea, or help you plan your bike trip to the East Coast. And obviously we couldn't squeeze everything into this video, so feel free to ask any questions you have in the comments, and look forward to part 4, where we go over Korea's most famous cross-country bike path, the Four Rivers Path. Thank you so much for watching, and happy cycling!